Well, good evening to you again. This is our ninth study. I'd like for you to turn in your notes, if you would, to 1 Timothy chapter 5. It's actually on page 9, 1 Timothy chapter 5. We're going to pick up here with 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 5, which says, "Now she who is really a widow and left alone, trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day." And I want you to notice how it says here that this particular lady has been left alone. Those are some significant words for Paul to mention here. There's no idea of death here. It's not that her husband died. I think that normally that's the way that we think of a widow, is that her husband has died. But in this case, it just means that the woman, for whatever reason, has been left alone. Her husband may have, we mentioned it in our last session, that her husband may have deserted her. He may just have abandoned her. She may have been married to a polygamist before she was saved, and after that, he didn't want to have anything to do with her Christianity whatsoever. So the word just simply means solitary, alone. It does not necessarily imply the idea of discomfort. Rather, the sense is that she had no children, she didn't have any other descendants, and nobody on which she could depend for support. There are just a lot of people like that. I mean, it's a frightening thing for people to get old and to be and to not have any means of support for their life. And women, especially elderly women, it would be very, very difficult for them to find any kind of meaningful employment. And because there were no secular institutions and no programs to help assist them other than the church, they were in dire straits. And most widows were simply reduced to poverty. There are times when we may go out to eat something. Let's just say I went to a fast food restaurant, and I went to a Hardee's or a McDonald's or someplace like that, In fact, I remember not long ago, and I guess that's what prompted my memory here, was that I had stopped somewhere to pick up a quick lunch or supper or whatever, and I drove up to the window to make the order and receive my order. I'd already made the order, and there was this elderly lady that was working behind the counter there. I mean, she had white hair, she was wrinkled, and she just looked old. I mean, she looked to me like she was in her 80s. And I felt so sorry for her. I mean, I just felt like, wow, this poor lady apparently doesn't have any family or any way, maybe her husband is sick or something and she's having to work. I don't know, but obviously it was a very difficult situation for her. And so what Paul provides, I think, here, and I think we have to see it this way. I think we're naive and undiscerning if we don't actually glean what Paul is really trying to do here. He's given the church a test. You have a test. I would say that your tests are fairly easy. I give you questions in chronological order. I mean, you can start on page 1, page 2, page 3. They're not out of order. They're no trick questions. I'm not trying to trick you. I just really want you to go through the notes again. I want you just to kind of take your time and find the answers, and I'm not trying to be difficult. I learn a lot more about what you're learning through your writing skills than you're just memorizing a lot of information. And so Paul has given a test. He's given a test to the church here, and the test is, how are they going to take care of their own? Or were they going to take care of their own? Maybe is the right question. I mean, this entire issue was a test of the early church's spiritual character, and it is a test of your church's spiritual character as well. How you handle those within your midst that are more unfortunate and do not have the same privileges and the same wealth that you may have, how are you going to take care of them? How are you going to minister to them? Their genuine devotion to Christ could be seen how they handled this particular situation. In other words, you can tell me that you're devoted to Christ and that your church is devoted to Christ, but if you don't take care of those people in your midst that have what we want to call real and legitimate needs, the character of your Christianity is waning. It's not very valuable at all. I'm not saying that every situation, that in every incident, that everybody has got to be just given lots of money, and I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying, how does your church take care? I mean, how do you deal with individuals in your church or families in your church that it could get a lot worse. Things could get a lot worse. My church we don't have much money in the bank. We don't keep much money in the bank. It's by design. I was talking to a brother the other day, and he told me that their church, had almost $200,000 in the bank. And I said, well, I mean, that's fine. I mean, if you want to keep that much in there, but I mean, operating-wise, you could operate for a long time on that kind of money. And I mean, what about people that in the world that have needs? I mean, what if the Lord came back tomorrow? And I'm not telling them to give the money away. I'm just think they need to reevaluate, and see how just watch God provide. Watch God take care of their church. And so it was not a problem, I think, that was just going to go away. It was a very lasting problem that was facing the church. In Romania, many of the widows are very destitute. They came out of communism in 1989, so the entire economy has not really had an opportunity to even address the issue. They're just now getting some good roads. I mean, they went from communism to capitalism almost overnight, and they didn't have the infrastructure to support that. And it was like a shock to their system. And I'm sure there were plenty of widows that were impacted by that. So what does Paul say to do with the widows? Well, he says, first of all, in verse 3, that you're to honor them. The word honor means to show respect, to show care, to give support. It carries the idea of providing support at whatever level is needed. I mean, it's the idea of what do you need? I mean, what kind of support is really needed? Is it physical support? Is it medical support? Is it financial support? Do you need food? Do you need shelter? Do you need wood for the fire? Do you need some money for electricity? What is it that you need? Do you need to go to the doctor and you don't have a ride? I mean, what is it that you actually need? And every church has moral obligations. They have responsibilities. They're God-ordained obligations and God-ordained responsibilities. And this particular word here for honor carries the idea of providing financial support as well as every other means of necessary support that would be needed to take care of a widow who truly was destitute. Anyone who has a legitimate need within the church is important. Anyone. It doesn't matter how old they are, how young they are, but there's probably nothing more precious to a church than for a widow who has some desperate needs. We had in our church, it was kind of an unfortunate thing to me. We had a couple that came all the time. They were an elderly couple. This is probably 4 or 5 years ago. And the husband, neither one of them were in good health. And they didn't have much. I mean, they literally just didn't have much. And this poor lady literally made hats for welders. She would make, they have this special hat that they put on that kind of helps protect their neck from all the flying stuff, and I don't know why they wear it, but I mean, all the ins and outs of it. It's a special hat, and she would make those, and she would sell them for like $5 or $10 a piece. I mean, how many could you make in a day? And how many people out there are there to actually sell them to? She knew some people, and she would sell them, and that was the way that they made their support. Well, her husband dies. Our church went over and helped him. We built up handicap ramps to get into their home. We helped redesign some things so that he could get around better. And then he died, and she was left alone. And we did everything that we could. We contacted her. We went to see her. And I know that financially that she just did not have the means to really take care of herself. And she was embarrassed. She was embarrassed. I mean, she literally was embarrassed to come to church because she knew that everybody was going to be asking how she was doing and all of these kind of different things, and wanting to know, what can we do for you? And she just didn't want to take it. Somehow she just, and it wasn't too long after that she died. And it was tragic because rather than getting the medical help that she needed, she just kept resisting. And I would call her. I would call her multiple times and leave messages, and she would never answer the phone. And the reason that she didn't answer the phone was because she was embarrassed about her situation and did not want to be a burden on the church. And I mean anybody who has a need is legitimate, but you find somebody like this, and it was even more critical. And I think her health declined because she just didn't have any money to eat well, and she didn't get any really good medical care. They didn't have any insurance, and she didn't want the church paying for all of that. And I mean, verse 3 says that the honors to be given to the widows who are really widows, and this woman was really a widow. I mean, I doubt she had money to put gas in the car, and unfortunately she wouldn't let anybody help her. And so the individual that Paul is talking about here had to really be a widow. Some of the women in the church were actually apparently trying to take advantage of the church and get some support. A lot of people probably do that with the government. They take advantage of the government and their situation. If you pay in Social Security and all the taxes that we pay and all the money that the government wastes, I certainly don't mind the government helping out people. I'm not against that at all. But by the same token, there's some people that just take advantage of the system. System's broke and they take advantage of it. And I don't think that's right. I mean, this person had to have some legitimate needs. So the church had the responsibility to have a means of properly evaluating whether or not somebody was a widow indeed. I like the way that Paul actually talks about that in verse 3. Honor widows who are really widows, And so you had to have a way of evaluating where somebody really needed the support. It's not a question of everybody just get in line. Now that would be ridiculous, Hey, you got a need, well just get in line. You got a need, just get in line. And hey, the church will give you everything that you need. And you'd have people lined up at the door, and you wouldn't be helping anybody. The church cannot just indiscriminately take on the needs of everybody who has a need. It has to evaluate the need in light of its own resources. My church has a limitation. And we have limitations as to what we can do and how long we can do it for somebody. So the criteria for making the evaluation comes in verses 4 through 8 here in 1 Timothy. I've got 1 Timothy 4, but it should be 1 Timothy 5. The church must be careful not to waste its resources on people who are not widows. People who are not widows at all. That's not what God wants us to do. That's not how we just spend our money. Certainly there are individuals, I think, that would milk local churches while they themselves refuse to work or to use their own resources wisely. As long as they can get a handout from the church, well, why not? Why go to work? I mean, if you can, and there are plenty of people that would try that in various churches. 1 Timothy, I don't know why I've gotten all this wrong here. It's 1 Timothy 5. You'll see that there. Let me just see if there are any other places here. I've just made a mistake. I'll have to go back and change it. And so you can adjust it. You can adjust it in your notes, and I'll go back and it'll probably be corrected when you have these notes. Excuse me for just a moment. I apologize. It's my fault. It's my fault. All right. It'll be corrected when you in your notes. So, in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 4, it's very clear that the first line of support for the widow should come from her immediate family members. Church, she's got sons and daughters, even grandchildren. The first responsibility for caring for the needy falls on the family and not on the church. It's not something that the church needs to take care of. If the woman has family members that are able, she may not have any children. She may not have any children. But if she does, and they're able to take care of her, then they need to take care of her. It's not the church's responsibility in that case. It may be that the family will not take care of them. And at that point, I think the church should jump in and provide some support. But the first responsibility falls on the family. And what we are going to find is that in a society where the family structure is deteriorating, we don't even know how to define a family anymore. But we live in a culture that all of that is declining and deteriorating at an incredible rate. There's going to be, as people become more selfish and more self-centered and more about what they have, and they don't want to waste their resources on family members, there's going to be less and less desire for family members to take care of that individual. 1 Timothy chapter 5 verse 4 says, "But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God." So these verses clearly indicate that the children and the grandchildren are to be the first line of support for the real widow. I only have one sister, and our mother passed away a couple of years ago, and my sister is not married. I mean, she's been married, but she's not married now. And her daughter lives on the other side of the United States. And if something happened to her, to my sister, I'm really her only family. Her immediate family would be her daughter. And I would hope and assume that they would help take care of her under those circumstances. But there are a lot of families where people aren't Christians, and they just somehow find a way of ignoring the legitimate needs that people have. So it uses the words here, "let them," and then "show piety." Strong says that to show piety, when used in relation to parents, means to give appropriate support for their well-being. It's talking about taking care of them. There's no way out of that in this passage. Especially if it's a Christian, you just have to take care of your family. Our parents supported and nourished us when we were young and helpless, and we ought to be willing to help and take care of them and support them when they are elderly and helpless. And this is called showing piety, and there's doubtless an allusion, I think, here to the 5th commandment, that you're to honor your father and your mother. And one part of that is to provide for them in their old age and in their afflictions. If you remember in one of the in the last class that we had, We read the verse where, or talked about where Jesus, on the cross, he only said something to the thief and to John to take care of his mother after he was gone. And so in verse 8 it actually says that if somebody does not provide for his own, and in this case I think it's talking specifically about he doesn't take care of his own, his mother, his father, whatever it may be, whoever it may be, even his own household. That person, it says here in verse 8, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Man, that's a strong statement. He is worse than an unbeliever. Very, very strong statement. That's a strong indictment. So the issue, I think, seems fairly clear. The widow should be first cared for by her family, and then if for whatever reason that does not occur, then the church has the responsibility to help. The church has the responsibility to do whatever it has to do to help take care of this individual. True godliness is first demonstrated within the family. And the family is the proving ground where godliness is really displayed. So the initial principle is clear that caring for widows is a family responsibility. It's a family responsibility, but it becomes a church responsibility if and when the family maybe is not available, the family is not close, and the family cannot do that. Somebody may be a missionary on the other side of the world, living in a Papua New Guinea, out in the middle of. We know people. I get a newsletter every month from a couple like that, and if their mother or father died and they didn't have any place to go, they couldn't just bring their mother over to Papua New Guinea and take them 500 miles out into a rainforest somewhere. It's just not going to be appropriate, and it would be appropriate in that case for the church to help. So how does the church evaluate a woman in this condition? Well, 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 5 through 8 says, "Now she who is really a widow and left alone, trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. She who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives, and these things command that they may be blameless. But if anyone does not provide for his own, especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." So this woman is really a widow. She's been left alone. She trusts in God, and apparently there's some spiritual content to her life. Now this is important. These words are not just given here. If it was just take care of anybody for any reason, these words wouldn't be here. All he would say is just take care of the widows, period. But he's given some definition. We're going to find out a little bit later that they need to be 60 years or older. I'm assuming that the reason for that is that unless there's a physical ailment, that the woman ought to be able to still gain some kind of sustenance at that point in her life. But if once she gets elderly, then it's going to be much more difficult for her to make a living. In verse 5, Paul provides information relative to the issue of evaluating widows. He says that she must in reality be a widow, one who's actually destitute. In fact, the woman who has children to support her and care for her would not be considered to be destitute. She just wouldn't be considered to be destitute. If a woman, her husband died and they didn't have any money and she didn't have anywhere taking care of herself, but her son that lived next door owned a large company and is worth $10 million, certainly she's not destitute. She's in a position where she has somebody to take care of her. So she may be a widow, but she may not be helpless, and she certainly may not be desolate. It was kind of interesting when my mother started her health began to deteriorate. We looked into what was known as I guess it was called an intermediate care facility. it was a home that, I mean, it was a really nice place. I mean, she wanted to do that. She wanted us to look into it for her. And she had the money to pay for it, and you know, it was fairly expensive. It was several $1,000s a month, and she wanted us to look into it for her, and so we did, and we went there. And this was a home where, you know, it was like you know, it had a living room and a dining area and a kitchen and place to sleep. Some of them 1 or 2 bedrooms, just a small efficiency type apartment, and couples would live there, and widows would live there. Widows that had money, and they had a nurse there was, you know, there all the time. But it wasn't like a nursing home. I mean, these people were ambulatory. They could get around. Some of them had cars. They could go places. You know, it's sort of like a retirement community. And then they had places on this site where they actually had homes, you know, individual homes that people lived in. And they weren't destitute. They weren't helpless. They may have been in their 70s and 80s, and yet they had the money and they had the resources. They would not be considered. You know, they would be somebody that just simply would not fall under this you know, this evaluation. He says here that this woman has to be left alone. In other words, what Paul is saying is that she has no way of taking care of herself. She's destitute. She doesn't have any family, or she doesn't have any family that's willing to help take care of her. She doesn't have any resources. The Amplified Bible translates it as being left entirely alone. I love that. I mean, the Amplified just seems to, it really pulls out the meaning here. This woman is all by herself. It was like the widow who had, I mean, the lady who had lost her son, you know, that we read about in the last class. The NIV says left all alone. The way that Paul emphasizes it here is that she is really a widow. You know, I like that. I mean, she is really a widow there in verse 3. And so this is, you know, this is one of those criteria that you have to evaluate. You have to use some judgment relative to all this. In fact, the word for left alone is mono, and it means to isolate. We derive the word mono from it, and it means single. But because it's in the perfect tense, it means that the individual is in a continual state. They're in a permanent state of being forsaken and without resources. You know, you could find yourself in this situation one day. I'm certainly getting older. I'm going to run out of resources. I know that. There's going to come a time where I'm going to be, you know, old enough and I can't work. I mean, nobody's going to want me. You know, nobody wants a 75, 80-year-old architect working for them. Somebody that's slow and has to go to the restroom a lot. You know, they're not. That's not what they're looking for. Somebody that's going to be having health problems. They want somebody that, you know, can do a lot of work and work a lot of overtime and all that kind of stuff. You know, it's everybody is going to face this at some point in time. I'm not here to talk about retirement and what you got to do to, you know, your portfolio. I'm not talking about that at all. I'm really, and I don't want to drift into that topic, but at least I want to say that in the culture in which we live, I mean, an economy could collapse overnight. I mean, it's like a house of cards at the time. You never know what's going to happen. And it's certainly not something that is secure, if I can use that term, the kind of political and economic climate that we live in. You know, costs just keep driving up and up, and people make less and less, and there's no telling what it's going to be like in 5 or 10 years. And all of us could find ourselves in a situation like this. And we better, as a church, we better have some reasonable way to evaluate who it is that we're going to take care of and how. And we have God-given responsibilities to take care of a widow that is like this, that's in a permanent state of being forsaken and without any resources. However, at the same time, verse 5 says that she is one who trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. The term trust in God is the Greek word elpizo, and it means that she has fixed her hope on God. This lady is born again. I mean, we're talking about somebody that's a bona fide Christian, somebody that really loves Christ, that really loves God. She's fixed her hope on God. In fact, the New American Standard and the Amplified Bible actually translate it that way, has fixed her hope on God. The verb is also in the perfect tense, so what it's saying is that not only is she in a continual state of being without means to support herself, but she's also in a continual state of presenting herself to God as her only hope. Here's a woman that is really drawing strength from God. She understands her situation. She understands that she's destitute. She understands that she's desperate. You know, every time I see those pictures of people in the Sudan and you know, those refugee camps, and the mothers lugging around 2 or 3 kids, and the kids have got the big bellies, and you know, from malnutrition and from starvation, and you know, we don't have big bellies from that. We have big bellies from eating too much. They get big bellies because they don't have any food, and there's a certain disease that happens in the body, and these children just dying and starving. I think there's, if I'm not mistaken, that 25,000 people a day die from starvation. 25,000 people a day die from starvation. If you've ever been to different places in India, and they've got these, large trash heaps, and you'll see the kids out there, and they're running, and they're just trying to scavenge any kind of food they can from anything that's left over, and it's been dumped in that area. I mean, some of these ladies that are in these refugee camps, God's their only hope. I mean, God is their only hope. And I mean, they don't even have any hope for the most part. Many of them are not Christians. Dr. Ildefonso actually ran 4 refugee camps, I think down in Colombia or somewhere in Central America, for a good while. I mean, he was responsible for nearly 40,000 people. 4 refugee camps with 10,000 people in each one of them, and people dying every day. And he's told me the stories of, I mean, they've got just a big hole, and every day they're just burying people that are dying. And for everybody that dies, they got refugees coming in to take their place, and they have no medical help and no food. He's been to the United Nations on 7 occasions, I think, to ask for money, and just never received any from it. And I mean, people just destitute. I mean, literally just destitute. In our culture, we have a lot of government programs that help take care of people, and so that scene that I'm describing doesn't necessarily play itself out here in the United States the way that it might in other parts of the world. But in Paul's day, they just did not have these kind of programs. There was Rome, and then there was the church, and that was it. I mean, that was it. I mean, I'm sure that there were some things that may have, Rome may have done for its own people, but, the law of Moses had made a lot of provisions for widows and orphans. But in reality, unfortunately, the nation as a whole had become so despot that they had literally abandoned most of the practices that God had given in His Word to do. And in many religious circles, they were actually devouring widows' houses. That was one of the indictments that Jesus gave to the Pharisees. That they were taking advantage of widows. So what's known from the, listen, I say that, and I say it dogmatically. That same thing is going on today with a lot of these TV personalities, and they live these extravagant lifestyles, these opulent, extravagant, financially wealthy men and women, and they are just fleecing the flock. They're devouring widows' houses. I'd hate to be them and stand before God. I really would. So what's known from this verse is that this woman is truly a Christian. She's a widow who has her hope fixed on God, helping to meet her legitimate and her critical needs. And one of the ways that God has chosen to meet those needs is through us. It's through the local church. It's through the body of Christ being sensitive and recognizing. And I want to say, if you're going to be a pastor, if you're going to be in a position of leadership, you cannot just turn a deaf ear to these kind of issues. God's not going to let you do it. You can't just say, well, our church, we're not big enough. We can't do this, and just find a way to ignore it. You can't do that. You are a shepherd. You are somebody that needs to be cognizant and recognize the needs that are in your midst, and find out if they're legitimate needs. There are a lot of them that aren't, but if they are, I'm not just talking about a widow, I'm talking about anybody, to find ways that you can help to promote somebody's welfare, both their spiritual welfare and their material needs that they have. It's the second criteria here that I think it's very important. This woman has no family to take care of her, but she's a Christian. This widow is what is it? James says, this is. How does it say it? This is pure religion and undefiled before the Father, that they take care of the widows and the orphans. That's pure religion. That's doing the right thing. That's pure. That's the right way. That if you're going to be religious, brother, that's what you need to be doing. You need to be helping people that have legitimate needs. And so the second here is that she's a Christian who set her hope on God. And it's only to these kind of women that the church is responsible. It's not just somebody that has a need. It's somebody who has been faithful, who is very much dependent on God, and they are looking to God for their support. It does not mean that they could not help somebody else. But these are the scriptural conditions. If you've got to evaluate and you've got multiple needs, you've got to have a way, a formula, if you would, to set a priority on how you're going to make these decisions within your local church setting. In other words, the church may choose to help non-Christians. There have been plenty of times when our church has helped non-Christians. Just plenty of times when we have chosen to help different families and different individuals. We didn't feel bad about it. I was glad to help. It didn't bother me at all that they were lost. I don't, even to this day, I don't remember that anybody that we helped, that it legitimately made a big difference in their life. But as a church, the leadership of the church got together. We made that choice, and we helped some people out that their needs had become known to us, and we bought them food. Or I remember one people, they lived in a mobile home, a manufactured home, and they were very small. They had a big family, and they didn't have any way of cooling their home, and so we went and bought an air conditioner for them. It was one of those ones that you'd put in the window. It wasn't really expensive, but it certainly helped them, and they were some family members of a member of our church. That was how we found out about that, and so we went and helped them. Our elders, one of the elders actually went in and put the thing in. it was great. It was great. I was glad that we could do that. I think every church ought to do that. But the church must support the Christian women who are really widows indeed and who have fixed their hope on God. You have to support them. To me, I don't think that these verses are optional. I don't think there's anything here where Paul is saying, well, you can evaluate whether or not you want to help these legitimate widows. I think he's saying if this kind of widow is in your midst, then you go help her. You go do what you can do to help her. The way that Paul stated this in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10, he said, therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household, of faith. The church has the privilege, just a privilege, it's an honor to come to the help and to the aid of those who really trust in God, and especially a godly woman, especially a believing woman. And her very godliness is seen in the next phrase, that she is someone who continues in supplications and prayers night and day. And I think if you just want to simply state this, this is just talking about a godly woman. That's all that Paul's really trying to say. He's not going into a lot of detail. He's not giving us just 45 different things here to look at. He's saying, church, is this a godly woman? Is this woman, is she really destitute? Is she really alone? She's been left alone. She didn't have any way of taking care of herself. And she's a godly individual. Is she? And if she is, I want you to help take care of her. So, to me, these verses indicate that she's more than just a nominal Christian who's come every once in a while down to the church, and give a little bit of money here and there, and she's sort of attached herself to the church, if you would, and now she has a legitimate need, and so she expects the church to come out and do everything for her. That's just not. I don't think it's talking about that kind of situation. And that ought to be clear. I think the church as a whole ought to be more than, what's the right term, the church ought to be more than clear about what it's going to do. You remember, I remember when I taught on this in our church over an extended period of time. I think it probably took me 2.5, 3 years to teach through 1 Timothy on a Wednesday night, and when we got to this, we spent a lot of time because we had widows. We had widows in our midst. The lady that I was talking about in I think it was our last, it may have been in this session, the lady that didn't want to come, she sat under this. She sat under this teaching, and I just think she just didn't want the church to be obligated to help her. She felt awkward about that. They were very poor, and so I don't know specifically, but I just really believe that that they never were able to give much. She didn't make enough money on these hats to buy food, nevertheless to give money to the church. And we didn't want her to. She didn't have to. The church wasn't pushing for that ever. It's just not an issue here. And so this woman is a godly woman. She has a character. She loves God. She trusts in God. She knows that she has legitimate needs that she just cannot meet on her own, but she trusts in God to help meet those needs. I think about the widows in Romania who have no husband and no sources of heat in their homes. A lot of them, they cook on stoves, on wood stoves. In fact, they use their wood stove to heat their house. The one that they cook on is the one that they use to heat their house. Some of these homes may only have a couple rooms in them. Most of them only have four rooms maybe, and the whole family lives in that kind of environment, and they're just totally dependent on somebody else to go out and help them. They couldn't cut wood if they had to. They could not cut wood if they had to. And so somebody has to help them. to keep their homes warm. And it gets very, very cold there. They're totally dependent on somebody else. So the kind of widow that Paul has described here is a woman that really is worthy of the church helping her, and she's worthy of church support. And the church becomes the channel of support of God taking care of her. The church is the channel through which God has chosen to work. And the scriptures are not obligating the church to support every individual woman that it knows about who has these kind of needs. It's not doing that at all. Paul is clear, verse 5, when it says that it's for a woman who is really a widow. And she's got to meet these qualifications here. I mean, she's got to come under these conditions before the church is what I would call obligated to actually help her. The church may choose to help somebody. That's fine. But I think in this case it's obligated to help this particular kind of lady. So she's a widow, she's destitute, she's godly. And just to emphasize these qualifications in verse 6, but he says, but she who lives in pleasures did while she lives. In other words, you don't have to take care of that kind of woman. You know, she just lives in pleasure. She spent her whole life that way. You're just not obligated. You don't have to feel guilty about all of that. You know, obviously the church has somebody in its midst. It's not going to let somebody starve. And in our culture, that really just doesn't really become that big of an issue. But he starts here with the word but. It's a word that immediately sets up a contrast between what he has just said and what he is about to say. And he's saying that there's some women that may be widows, but they do not qualify for scriptural support. There are some widows, and very often younger widows in particular, who may not have any sense of godliness about their life. You know, they're still young. They have certain desires, and that are going to take them in a certain direction, and you just have to be very careful. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 11 through 13, Paul emphasizes this fact. He says, but refuse the younger widows. For when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they've cast off their first faith. And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. And we'll look at those passages in just a little bit. But they're living for their own indulgences and for their own pleasures. They're not really living, if you would, for the glory of God, and they've cast off their first faith, is what he actually says. This idea here is that they're not dependent on God. They're not trusting in God. They have other priorities in their life, and they're living for their own pleasure. They don't have a lot of personal devotion to the Lord Jesus Christ. And so it says in verse 6, but she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. It means that she's living for sexual pleasure. She's living for sensual pleasure. It means to live a life of immoral and lustful pleasure. She may be a widow, but you're certainly not obligated to take care of her. I mean, that's just very clear here. The RSV translates it as self-indulgent, or just living for their own personal pleasure. What Paul says is that the woman who lives this way is dead while she lives. He doesn't have anything really good to say about her. And he means that she is spiritually dead. That's what he's talking about. She's dead while she lives. I mean, she's alive physically, but she's dead spiritually. The word wanton in verse 11 actually means to live in such a way that they have no regard for what is right before God. I mean, here they are. Maybe they've been exposed to certain teaching, and they are aware and cognizant of what's right, but they're not willing to live in a way that's honoring to Christ. The NASB says, for when they feel sensual desires in disregard of Christ. So all of these translations are bringing this nuance of meaning out here. The NIV says, for when their sensual desires overcome their dedication to Christ. So here they are, and they've lost their dedication to Christ, and they're not living for Christ. Paul says that this woman is dead while she lives. So it appears from these verses that the woman may have been active in the church when her husband was living, but then when he died, she decided to enter into a completely different kind of lifestyle and eventually forsook the church. She forsook the things of God, the things of Christ in her life. She no longer had a commitment to God. She no longer had a commitment to Christ or to the church. And it was the death of her husband that sort of exposed all of this. And for that kind of woman, the church just doesn't need to provide anything. Doesn't matter, even if she had been there previously. She could be a leech. She could actually remove resources that God wanted to be directed to legitimate needs that people had in their life. And so the church is not obligated. It's just not obligated to help women who might lead ungodly lives. I would say in this passage does not talk about this, but we may be obligated to take care of her children. I think that's something that every church would have to wrestle with. It's a very real issue. The children are just, they're the pawns in some of these things, and the church would just have to figure out a way that how they could help with the children. Scripture has just as much to say about the fatherless as it does about the widows. In fact, the two are generally linked together. There are a lot of fatherless children who live in single-parent homes. We probably have as many children living in single-parent homes as we do that are living in two-parent homes. Now in verse 7, Paul says these words. He says, "In these things command that they may be blameless." These things is referring to everything that Paul has been saying since verse 3. In other words, if a believer has a godly widow in their family, maybe their mother, their mother-in-law, then they're responsible to take care of her and to do whatever it is that she needs so that she can be taken care of physically and financially, medically, whatever that may be. And the church is to do its part. I cannot tell you, I'm not willing, I don't even want to go there to say, well, this is what you have to do. What you have to do is you have to evaluate if it's a legitimate need. You have to determine the legitimate resources that you have as a church that you can expend on that individual, and then you have to find out a way, you have to figure out a way to help her. If she is indeed she has a legitimate need. Every situation is different. Every situation is absolutely different and needs to be evaluated separately. Once again, I think these verses serve as a test for the New Testament church. And will we take care of our own and all those people in our church that have legitimate needs? I wonder what the landscape of the modern day evangelical church would be if it stopped building all these monuments to its churches and to its ministries and started doing more practical things like Paul is talking about here. I'm amazed at what the church is willing to do. And I'm amazed at what the church is not willing to do. I know in my church that we've made some very, very, I think, godly decisions, some right decisions. I'm sure if the Lord were to just come and give His perfect plan, that there would be a lot of things that would be missing. But we made a decision a long time ago, I'm talking a long time ago, that we were not going to spend our resources on facilities. Now that puts us at a disadvantage. It puts us as a disadvantage. I mean, if you went to some new churches and you went into their nursery, and I know that if you don't take care of people's kids, they won't come to your church, and they shouldn't. You know, our nursery is it's just kind of nothing fancy about it. I mean, it's just not a fancy nursery. What makes it good is it's got incredible, amazing people in it that take care of the children with so much care and so much nurturing. You know, I'm just elated. I'm thrilled with the kind of care that our kids in the nursery receive. And so, you know, that's what's really important. You could take your children to a church that's hired people to, I know some churches, they actually hire people to stay in the nursery because they have a lot of people that don't want to keep the nursery, so they go out and they hire people to keep the nursery. And I can't tell you, I really honestly cannot tell you if those people would have the same level of interest in your child as somebody else that maybe would be in the church who actually had children in the nursery. So we've made some hard decisions. We've lived by those, and we're going to continue to live by those, so that we can free up our resources to help missionaries, to help people that have really specific needs, that are out giving their life for Christ. And we're going to do everything we can to do that. And it's a legitimate direction, but it's much different than the institutional church in the 21st century, trust me. And we can't, we're not trying to compete. We wouldn't even, we would never compete with another church for their members. We just don't work that way. It's just, I feel uncomfortable when somebody comes and they want to transfer a letter from another church that's down the road somewhere here. I feel very uncomfortable about that. I have long talk with people. I say, look, I want to make sure while you're leaving, you've gone to your pastor, you've talked about it, you've worked through these things. You know, you've got to have some level of that's the right term, some level of integrity about wanting to join our church. You know, it's just that ministry of discouragement again, of making sure that we're not just doing things the wrong way all the time, you know. It's kind of a false growth, isn't it? Paul wraps up what he's saying in verse 8. He says, but if anyone does not provide for his own, especially for those of his household, then he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. He says that if you do not pay attention to what he is saying, then you have actually become worse than an unbeliever. If you as a church, if we as a church are not paying attention to these verses, we have denied the faith. We have denied what it means to be a Christian. Man, these are stiff words. You can't just walk away from a verse like that and say, well, you know, it's just talking about widows and I'm not really interested in widows. We're talking about people that have legitimate needs, and we just sort of walk away from it as if we don't have any obligation or any responsibilities to help them. And this is a very indicting statement. He says, you're worse than an unbeliever. It just doesn't get any stronger than that. Worse. It's not that you're an unbeliever, it's that you're worse than an unbeliever. I mean, how strong of a statement could he make? The impression in studying this is that the latter here in verse 8 versus what was stated in verse 4, up here in verse 4 where it talks about this is good and acceptable before God and all that kind of stuff. It says, it leads us to think that unfortunately there were a lot of violations of this going on in Ephesus. I think that's why these strong words are given. In the context, it was a very immoral location. Ephesus had the goddess Diana there and the temple prostitutes that would come down every night and and do their dancing and temple prostitutes, right? Religious prostitutes. And they would come down and entice men, and they'd go back up to the temple, and they would, they'd make a living with prostitution, and I mean, Paul was addressing in chapter 2 that a lot of the women in the church apparently were starting to mimic the world and dress like these prostitutes, and all this braiding of the hair and the jewelry that went in it and the expensive clothes, and they were looking like the world, and he just forbid it. And he's putting this in the same category, that if you as a church are not taking care of these kind of situations, that you're worse than an unbeliever. You're literally worse than an unbeliever. And this church here in Ephesus had already lost its witness to the lost. It had lost it. It literally left its first love. If you go to Revelation chapter 2, and so there must have been many cases when lost people were taking care of their widows, but the church was not. Now, and you just have to read in between the lines here as to what Paul is actually saying. And the obvious reference here is twofold. It's his own and his household. The phrase his own refers to people that may not be in a believer's immediate family, people that are beyond family, but people that they have a deep and abiding relationship with, relatives, other relatives. It could be some friends. It could even be some neighbors. I mean, the word is extensive enough in its meaning to actually stretch out and mean just anybody that that you're associated with. God allows certain people to come into your life for a particular reason. And so the idea here is that it could be anybody. And very often our churches pray for people who do not go to our church, but people who are neighbors of some of our members. It's not just a matter of the church helping. That's not the issue here. It's the idea of believers personally helping. It's not the idea that you just come in and say, well, I want our church to pray for these people, and then I want us to do something for these people. It's not that at all. It's the idea that we recognize that there are needs, and we go out and we help to meet those particular needs. Very often people will come to me and say, so-and-so really needs some money to help them out in a critical situation, and most of the time it's not a lot. It's $200, $300, something like that. So the question is, can the church help out? And normally my first thought is, well, can you do that? Can you do that? I mean, I don't mind the church helping, and certainly there are plenty of times when we do, but is there any reason why you can't do that? I mean, if it's only a couple $100, come on. Get off the dime and help somebody. Just go out and do it. You're a Christian. You're born again. You can do it. In other words, it is not right to ask the church to do something that you're actually able to do, but just do not want to do it for different reasons. You don't want to lose your resources, but you're willing for the church to spend its resources. In other words, just don't ask the church to do something that you're not willing to do yourself. Well, I'll just ask the church to do this and to take care of this person. It would cost me too much, and it'd be too much of an inconvenience for me. I'll ask the church to go out and visit and to determine what the needs are. And I ask the elders to go out and do that. And that's not scriptural. That's not even Christ-like, if you take that position. A lot of times the reason that we meet and know people that have legitimate needs is so that we can be the very instrument that God uses to meet that need. He wants us to demonstrate Christian love. He wants us to demonstrate compassion. He wants us to have a heart that is willing to help somebody out and to give and to help support them in whatever way that they may need. I mean, it could be any kind of a help. It could be emotional help, physical help. I do a lot just kind of, I just call it almost social counseling. You know, it's not like I'm sitting in my office and I've got somebody there and I'm counseling them. I've tried to stop counseling any more than I actually have to. It's so draining. But I'll do it. I mean, if somebody comes, they have a legitimate need. I'm getting ready to start some marriage counseling this summer for a young couple in our church that's going to get married. And I mean, they've asked me if I would give them some marriage counseling. I say, yeah, it'd be at least 6 or 8 weeks. You know, it'll take 1 to 2 hours every night. So if you're gonna, before I marry you, we're gonna do some counseling, and you're gonna have to be willing to make the commitment to do it. And they said that'd be fine. You know, it could be any kind of help, any kind, and I don't want to just limit it to like financial help. I think that would be wrong. We all have an obligation to the church to support the church. You know, the church can't exist if the members don't support it, both physically and financially. So, you know, very often what God wants believers to do in helping someone is to help them sacrificially, where that person knows that you're doing something for them sacrificially, something that is vital to them, something that's important to them, something that is meaningful to them. They see that, they recognize that. It makes an impact on them. It's something that helps them to have a better picture of what it means to be a Christian. And this is, those are some real Christians down there at that place. I think that's what God is really after. In our culture, many people do not like the idea of having to give sacrificially. I mean, honestly, if they had to give sacrificially, it's not something that they want to do. And so very often the easy out is to ask the church to meet that need. And in many cases it may be appropriate to do so, but by the same token, I think in a lot of cases it is not appropriate to do so. So what I'm doing is I'm encouraging you from just a personal perspective that if you know that somebody has legitimate needs, to not just always be throwing the weight of that responsibility on the church. If there are needs that you can meet, I mean, if somebody needs $2,000, and obviously you may not have that, so I'm not trying to obligate you to that, but I am saying to you that there are going to be things that you can do. You can help somebody build something. You can go down to the grocery store and buy. We had a couple that we helped out for a good while, and it was a young couple. They were destitute. They were destitute, but a lot of that was very self-inflicted. But they had needs. I mean, legitimate needs at that time in their life. And there were members of our church that I know would take them down to the grocery store and buy them food, and it would come out of their pocket. They never tell. Come to church and say, well, would you give me $100 for, the food I bought for them? I mean, they just went down and bought the food, got them a week's worth of groceries, whatever it was. And it was neat. I mean, I kind of got out of the way. There are a lot of people, a lot of different people that helped. And so, just want to be very careful here. Now, what is the problem if believers are supposed to help meet other people's needs, but they don't do that? They know that the need is legitimate. It's the idea of just be warmed and be filled, but notwithstanding, they don't give them the things that they need. You can't just, well, God bless you, brother. If somebody has a legitimate need and you recognize that, then you and I generally have a legitimate obligation to help meet that need. Paul says in verse 8 that if somebody doesn't do this, that they've denied the faith. They've denied the faith. They've denied what it actually means to be a believer. That's strong language. They have denied the biblical principles that call on every believer to be compassionate toward those people who have legitimate, serious needs in their life, whether they're relational, emotional, physical, spiritual, financial, whatever it may be. They have legitimate needs. And we can deny the faith by our lack of deeds as much as we can by our words. And so in the story of the Good Samaritan, you remember the story. The good people just passed by, right? They just passed by. They just went by. It looked like the guy in the road, then just kind of went around him. And they were in a hurry. They just didn't have time to stop and to help. And they were just in a hurry, and off they go. And the religious people just pass by. It does not matter how many times we attend church or how much we do down at the church. If we close our hearts and our lives to those people that have legitimate needs, then we have denied the very principles that we say make us a believer and make us a Christian. We cannot just turn away from legitimate needs that people have. Secondly, Paul says that we are actually worse than an unbeliever. If lost people will do this for their loved ones, certainly Christians ought to be willing to do the same. I was watching something the other day. I was watching a golf tournament. It was on a Sunday afternoon. We were getting we normally go out to eat on Sunday after church, and we come home and my wife always takes a little nap. She might take a nap for a half hour, 45 minutes or something like that. And we were getting ready to come back to church. Excuse me. My voice is doing a little better than it was in the last class. And I was watching a golf tournament on TV. It was the St. Jude's golf tournament. And St. Jude's is a hospital, I think it's up in Memphis, Tennessee, or somewhere like that, where they provide free medical care to children that don't have the resources and have cancer. So we're talking about some serious needs that children have. And if you see the pictures of the kids, they all hooked up, and they got IVs all over them. They don't have any hair, and they're just little kids, and their families could lose them, and it's just a horrible thing. Kids that have various cancers and leukemia, and it just goes on and on. It takes $20 million a day. 365 days a year. $20 million a day. Now you do the math as to how much money it takes over a year for this place to operate. It's a very large hospital. They have tremendous needs. And most all of their the monies come in through foundations, through people that just on a regular basis, on a monthly basis, send a check in to the St. Jude's Hospital. An amazing place. I mean, this is not necessarily a Christian place. I'm not saying that it doesn't have believers that are there, obviously, but just think of the people that give. And a lot of lost people that are giving to help meet legitimate needs in the lives of these children. So Paul says that we're just worse than an unbeliever here. Jesus asked John to take care of his mother. I don't think that if Jesus was 33, we'll say when he died, most people believe that Mary was probably 14 to 16 years old when she became pregnant. Even if she was 20 years old, which I think probably 16 to 18 may be, how old she was when she gave birth to Christ. And but she couldn't have been much over 50 years old. I mean, at best. I mean, at best. Even if she had been 20 years old, that would have made her 53. He still saw to it that John would take care of her. He didn't tell her to go get a job, which would have been okay. He told John to make sure that her needs were being met. He didn't tell her how to do that. He didn't tell him how to do that. In that scene, you have to see the very heart of God. Here the Son of God, the God-man, is dying on the cross, and he's trying to get somebody to help take care of his mother after he's gone. I want us to appreciate that when we think of the church, that the church is you and me. You know? Somehow we think of the church as everybody else. And we kind of include ourselves in there, but the church is really us. It's us collectively. It's not somebody else. It's me. So when I think about the things that the church has to do, I have to do that. You know, these are things that I have to kind of build into my life, things that I have to do in order to be the church. You know, I don't want people to come to church. I want people to be to the church. Dr. Sullivan says that all the time. In fact, I think that's one of on the outside of his church. He's got a sign out there or something, and it says something like, "We don't just come to church. We are the church." I don't know exactly what it says, but it's the idea that we are to be the church in our life. It's not somebody else. It's us, and we cannot do collectively what we're not willing to do individually. So the more individuals that you have that are willing to commit their lives to legitimate needs that people have, then obviously the more that you can do collectively as a church. It's a sacrificial quality that we're talking about here. It's a personal sacrifice to take care of other people and their needs, and especially those of your own household. And in doing so, we're fulfilling one of the most basic principles of the Christian life. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 9 and 10, it states, "Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, not unless she has been the wife of one man, well reported for good works. She's brought up children, if she's lodged strangers, if she's washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work." Up to this point in our study on widows, the focus has been on ensuring that those who are truly widows are taken care of financially. That they've been taken care of physically, that their needs are actually being met. And the first duty is to provide that. The first line of defense for that is their children and their grandchildren are to do that, their immediate family. And if the widow has no relatives and nobody that can do that, and certainly in that day and age, I'm sure that happened quite frequently, then the church was to take care of that particular individual. But when we get to verse 9, Paul gives what appears to be a kind of list, or a register, maybe would be the better word, a roll of widows. It says, for instance, in verse 9 and 11, just be careful here as we read this. It says, "Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number." Well, what does that mean, into the number? And not unless she's been the wife of one man. Verse 11, "But refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry." Refuse the younger women. What does that mean? Well, these qualifications here, I think, seem to be qualitatively different than the ones that we have just previously read and studied. For instance, in verse 9, she has been the wife of one man. And in verse 10, there's a whole listing of qualifications given. Well reported for good works, she's brought up children, she's lodged strangers, she's washed the saints' feet, she's relieved the afflicted, she has diligently followed every good work. That's a long list of godly attributes and godly things in this woman's life that she has done. And so what we want to notice is that there is a very big shift here that is distinct and obvious and does not need to be missed. You know, you can just be reading along, and you if you're not careful, you can get to this place and not realize that there's kind of a shift here. I would almost call it a major shift in the way that Paul is describing something. It's almost like he's talking about two different things. In this listing of widows, the apparent reason is because they are widows who are willing to give of themselves for the service of the local church. This number, this roll call, if you would, this register, this roll of widows. These are women who are willing to give of their life in serving Christ and in being obedient to the gospel and being a part of the local church. In fact, the qualifications, I think, almost in some way seem to mirror those qualifications given for the elders and the deacons in 1 Timothy 3. They're not exact, they're not duplications of those qualifications, but they're very similar here. So first of all, she's to be a one-woman man. This is the wife of one man. In other words, this was a woman who, in my mind, it's saying the same thing that it said in 1 Timothy 3 when it talked about the qualifications of an elder or overseer and the qualification of a deacon, that they had to be a one-woman man. They couldn't be womanizers. They had to be, it doesn't mean that it means that they loved their husbands. They only had a heart for their husband. Their husband may have died and they may have gotten married again. And they loved their new husband. And they were just a one-woman man. I mean, a one-man woman, if you want to call it that way. So, you know, the wife of one man. That phrase is not referring to marital status. It's exactly what we were talking about the men in chapter 3. It's referring to whether or not she was fully devoted to her husband. You know, I really believe that my wife is just fully devoted to me. I can go anywhere, anytime. My wife is as faithful. I'm not afraid. I don't have any reservations. My wife trusts me explicitly. I'm the one that actually travels. But I mean, I'm always with somebody. But I mean, my wife is just she's a one-man woman. You know, she's devoted to me as her husband, and that's what we're talking about here. A widow who did not measure up to this standard would not be a proper role model for younger women. I mean, if you had a woman that was a manonizer, I don't think that's a word, but a woman who was always out there flirting and dressing inappropriately and you know, just doing things that weren't appropriate. Excuse me, something in my eye. Something got in my eye. If you know, that wouldn't be the kind of woman that you would want representing your church. You wouldn't want her to be somebody that was representing what it is that you do. To the contrary, it just wouldn't be proper, and so you wouldn't want to include her in the number. In the number, 1 Timothy 3:1 says that the elder must be a one-woman man, and it says the same thing for deacons. And it says the same thing here for this woman. Secondly, she must be well reported for good works, and the elder is to be blameless, of good behavior. 1 Timothy 3:7, moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside. The deacon in verse 10 is to be found blameless. In verse 13, they must serve well. So she's a woman that's well reported of for her good works. Thirdly, she's to brought up children, and the implication is that she's done that well. She's been a great mother. She's just been a great mother. You know, she understood what she had to do to help her children and to help them make it so they could be self-sufficient and all of that. It means to nourish children. She's reared her children in such a way that they are following the Lord. I'd say that she's raised them in a way to follow the Lord. Some of them may or may not have, but to me personally, that has to be a woman's greatest privilege and responsibility. is the raising of her children in a godly way. The elder is to rule his own house well. So there's kind of a parallel here. The deacon is to rule their children well. In verse 12, she's to have lodged strangers or shown hospitality. An elder in verse 2 is called on to be hospitable. In this day, they didn't have motels. My wife and I were riding down one of the main roads here in the city outside of which we live, and they had a new motel, a new motel going up. It was a 4-story thing, and I was just shocked. I'm going, man, we've got motels everywhere. They're just, you could throw a stone at about 3 or 4 more that were just within a mile of each other. I mean, it's just, you keep riding and there's more and there's more and there's more, and they just keep building them, and they didn't have motels. They had inns, and the inns weren't really what we, they weren't big buildings that had multiple rooms and room service and all that kind of stuff. It was just a place where somebody could lie down in that day. And so she was somebody that washed the saints' feet. I think, which once again, I think what that means is that she was a humble person. Back then they didn't have shoes and socks like we do, and they had sandals. It was dusty, and you'd come into the house and they'd have water, and they would, just like Jesus did with his disciples, and she would wash the saints' feet. She relieved the afflicted. The elders were to be gentle and not quarrelsome. She's to have diligently followed every good work. What needs to be understood is that in the early church is that there were a group of widows who were given what we want to call a kind of semi-official status within the church. They were servants. They weren't necessarily leaders. They didn't make decisions, but they had a kind of status in the church. When we studied in chapter 3 about those that hold to the idea that you can have women deacons, and you certainly couldn't, if you don't have elders, you certainly couldn't have that, but if you had elders and then you had people that were just servants, you could have women servants, not people that in positions of leadership, just servants. And we talked about that in some detail, but it could have been some of the women like this that Paul is talking about. The early church had male elders, but they also had male deacons and female servants. I want to just call them servants. People that were servants. I don't want to give them the title deaconess, or I just think that's a little too controversial and probably not consistent, I think, with Scripture and the way that Scripture would describe this. We're talking about people here who are godly women, people who have, been faithful. We just went through a whole list of things, found blameless, good mothers, love their husbands, people who have been very, shown a lot of hospitality, and they've relieved the afflicted, they've followed every good work, and they're servants. And in Romans chapter 16, verse 1 through 5, Paul is giving his farewell commendation, and he says, I commend to you Phoebe, our sister, who is a servant of the church in Cenchrea. So Phoebe could have been one of those individuals who fit into this category. It's not to say that she didn't have a husband, but it is to say that she was recognized as being a servant, that you may receive her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the saints, and assist her in whatever business she has need of you. So the church from Cenchrea has sent her along. I think what Paul is actually saying is that Phoebe is probably the one that delivered his letter to the Romans, to that particular church. And it says she's been a helper of many and of myself. Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their own necks for my life. To whom not only I give thanks, but also all the churches of the Gentiles. These were women that were spiritually strong, and they had they played a unique role in this early church. And just like the elders and the deacons, they had to have demonstrated in their life certain foundational qualities that existed. And apparently these widows were put on the listing. They were put on a listing. And they had to be at least 60 years old. That's what verse 9 says. The younger widows were not allowed to be on that list. That's why he says refuse the younger widows. In verse 11, refuse the younger widows. And then Paul gives us a description of why, when they begin to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, they have condemnation because they've cast off their first faith, and besides that, they learn to be idle, and they're wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, and they say things that they ought not. And I desire that the younger widows marry. Listen, ladies, and that's what Paul is saying, that if you're a widow, you're a young widow, you got children, you need to go and you need to remarry. Bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully, for some have already turned aside after Satan. And it appears from other portions of Scripture that the primary role of these older widows was to minister to the younger women in the church. Had a lot of younger women that were apparently widows. Their husbands maybe had been killed in a war, or been called off and died and been abandoned, whatever it may be. This 5 gives a description of both qualifications and responsibilities when it says, for women likewise, that they be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things, that they admonish, warn, teach the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be blasphemed. I mean, can you imagine, just think about this for a minute. Can you imagine what the modern church would be like today if for whatever reason we could just appreciate what Paul is teaching here and kind of embrace this kind of ministry, this kind of teaching into our local churches? I mean, go into the home of a young couple, somebody encourage the wife to love her husband and to be faithful to him, and to help the young mother understand what it takes to be a good mother and to raise her kids, and how to remain chaste and committed to Christ, and all those kind of things. I mean, it would be godly women passing on godly wisdom. Well, I think that that's exactly what was taking place here, what Paul is identifying. He's talking about these ladies, these women that were older, and they would teach the women. You know, they would have to probably go into their home, or have the younger women come to their home. And so we don't know, we don't know in what official type capacity these older women served, but we do know that the church officially recognized them. They put them on the list. They made them in the number. And if they didn't do that, there wouldn't have been a need for this listing that carried with it both qualifications and responsibilities. I mean, verse 10 is a whole list of qualifications. And I don't think that it's the same. I think you have to appreciate that. It's not the same as identifying a widow who just has a legitimate need and the church needs to take care of her. This is identifying those women in verse 9 who are not taken into the listing. They're not taken into the number unless they're at least 60 years old. They have these different qualifications. They see them as kind of an official group within the church that's able to minister. There's no evidence that these widows were supported by the church, even though some of them could have been. There's nothing to say that they couldn't have been. There's no indication that they were ordained in any way. They were just godly women who were willing to invest their lives in other people, and the church fully recognized that ministry as being vital and critical. I mean, within the institutional church in America, 50% of the people in the average congregation have been divorced. 50%. You know, we have single, families with single parents. We have parents, children that they have their mother, but it's not their father, or vice versa. There's a tremendous need for these kind of things here. We'd be foolish not to recognize that. Certainly this passage is not saying that a woman has to be a widow before they can do these things, and it's not limiting that kind of service to just women as well. These women were serving as an example of unselfish service to the entire church. So this listing was that of the older widows who served officially for the church in different capacities. They weren't to be out teaching the men. We've already dealt with that here in chapter 2. They were just to be helping instruct the younger women. We're talking about building strong families is what we're talking about here. And giving some divine instruction and some practical assistance to how these women could raise their children, how they could be better wives, what it meant to be a godly woman. I would say things that were, how to dress properly, how not to dress inappropriately. These women were serving as an example of unselfish service to the entire church. So this listing was that of the older widows who served officially, I think that's the right term, officially for the church in different capacities. And in the qualification that identifies that they washed the saints' feet and relieved the afflicted, in those qualifications, what they were to do was to visit the sick. They relieved the afflicted. That means that they went somewhere where somebody was sick and they helped take care of them. There were a lot of sick people. There were a lot of people that had, they didn't have the medical, they might not have had all the medical problems that we have today, but they certainly did not have all of the medical opportunities that we have today. So somebody had to help them. And sometimes it would be a lot of help, especially if it was an elderly person or somebody that was fairly large and you had to help them move around and get up and walk and go from one place to another. My mother-in-law is a fairly large woman, and she's had her knee replaced. She can't walk. Literally, she just cannot walk. If she can stand up, she can't lift her foot up. She can just kind of drag it. And we have a full-time lady that stays with her until my sister-in-law gets at home. Gets home, and she's a handful. It takes. There have been plenty of times when we've rushed up there when she's fallen or fallen on the floor. And that's what these women were doing. They were helping to relieve those kind of different things. They lodged people who were itinerant preachers passing through. They ministered to the visitors and even strangers. They visited those Christians who were in prison and had been persecuted for their faith. And I have to say that it just from reading all of this, it appears that in the early church that this was a very important ministry. This was a vital part of the church. Just think about how much attention Paul is giving to this. Based on everything else that we've been studying here, this is our second semester in it. Just think of all the things that we've been studying, how much attention Paul has given to the practical needs of how these elderly women are to minister in the church and how we as the church are to minister to these elderly women that have legitimate needs. This is as practical as it gets. In your church, there may not be a lot of widows. I don't have a lot of widows in our church. We basically have one widow in our church. This lady is an angel. We would do anything for her. So we don't have a big need. I mean, we're a small church, so we don't have a big need for this. But we recognize her value. In fact, for years, we asked her to teach the class for the younger women during Sunday school, which she did. And she just got physically, she's not able to move around well. She has osteoporosis and she's bent over, and it's just a lot more difficult for her. So she talked to the ladies and got another lady to take her place, but you just couldn't hardly get into class. I mean, honestly, the women just flocked to her class. They loved her, and the younger women especially, and the way that she treated them with such grace. And so there, we know in the early church there were widows, there were orphans. They had tremendous needs. Christians were being persecuted everywhere. One can imagine the kind of godly counseling and encouragement and support that would be needed by the younger women who had lost their husband. Maybe their husbands had died. They had a young family. They didn't have any means of support. We had a missionary that we supported in Zimbabwe. His name was Agrippa Dube, and Agrippa had personally, he was probably responsible for nearly 1 million people coming to Christ. And if I'm not mistaken, in his own personal life, just as he was responsible for evangelism explosion in Zimbabwe and 9 other African countries. He was the director for all of that. But before he ever did that, he spent his entire life on a bicycle, mostly out in the bush, going from hut to hut, from village to village, ministering to people, establishing churches, winning people to Christ. And in his life, at a personal level, he probably had led well over 60 to 70,000 people to Christ. It might have been more. And then he became responsible for the programs where people just came to Christ in just large numbers. And he wasn't feeling good one day, and he lives in Zimbabwe and wasn't feeling good. And he came to our church probably once a year, and would visit with us. And when he'd come over here, he's sort of raising support, I guess. And I guess he just kind of got pneumonia, and he went into the hospital, and they wanted him to stay, and he said, "No, I've got too much work to do." And in about 2 days, he was dead. He died. In these places, in this kind of environment, that was what could happen to somebody. They could get sick and never recover. And so you can imagine the support that these younger widows needed if something happened to their husband. In Zimbabwe, they could be killed by a wild animal. No question about it. Just killed by a wild animal. And so these older widows would care for the sick and the needy, and they were available to move around in the ministry. They weren't tied down. Their family was, they weren't raising a family. Their husband was gone. In fact, in Acts chapter 9, we read about, I'm not going to read this whole passage. You can read it if you'd like, about these widows in Joppa, and about this lady Dorcas that had died. Is it Dorcas? Tabitha, which is translated Dorcas, and she became sick and died. But she ministered. All the widows stood by weeping and showing the tunics which Dorcas had made while she was with them. So most commentators seem to indicate that this group of widows in Joppa that we're talking about here was probably one of these listings, one of these in the number group of ladies, and Dorcas was just one of them. Just imagine the oneness of a group like this. I mean, just imagine the oneness, the unity that existed in a setting like this, where the elderly women would come together and they prayed and they would minister. They would minister to the saints and take care, help with the sick and take care, relieve the afflicted and wash the strangers' feet. This was an incredible group of women. I mean, this was an incredible. You're talking about ministry. Now we're talking about ministry here. This is not a paid group of people. They're probably not making a dime. They're just doing whatever they can do to help. And they were servants in every sense of the word. We know from history and the writing of Tertullian at the end of the 2nd century that there was an order of widows that existed. Both this time and in the 3rd century, the registered widows gave themselves to prayer. They cared for the sick. They cared for orphans. They visited Christians that were in prison. They evangelized pagan women, and they taught younger women. We know that historically, that's exactly what took place. Other important documents in the 3rd, 4th century refer to an official order of widows. And I'm not saying that your church has got to create one. That's not my intent here. But I'm just saying that this is what the Scriptures is referring to. And we need to be sensitive that it was something that had a very real impact. I mean, this was an impactful group of women that ministered in the church. In verse, just the fact that she had to be 60 years or older, there were 3 qualifications given here relative to whether or not the women could be in this listing. They had to be 60 years or older. While they were married, they had to have marital fidelity. They had to be, thirdly, they had to be women that were prone to good works. And so just the fact that they had to be 60 years or older indicates that the list was not a list of widows eligible to receive support simply because in verse 3 through 8 it doesn't give any age there as to how old that they had to be. You could be a legitimate widow and be 25 years old in verses 3 through 8. You didn't have to be 60. I think I might have mentioned that erroneously in one of the classes. It might have been this one or the previous one. But just to clarify that, there was no age limit. I mean, you could be 20 years old and be a widow and have a legitimate need. I mean, you have 3 kids running around and no means of income and no way to, their family gone, and the church would need to help in that case. In this case, my understanding is that this woman could have been remarried if her first husband had died, which happened often in that culture. In fact, in verse 14, the younger women are encouraged to remarry. So she could have been a godly woman to begin with. Her husband died. She was still a young lady, had children. She got remarried, and she was faithful to her second husband. Here are older women who have ministered faithfully for a long time. They've been servants to the church. They've been a member of it. They've lived a godly life. They were godly women. They were servants. And I have to say that those who are the servants in my church are without any questions the ones that have my ear. They're the ones that I listen to the most. They have the greatest influence on my life personally. I will listen to them. Their service to God's church and to God's kingdom is a mark of great honor, and it deserves great respect. And I think it's obvious from Paul's admonition not to place the younger women on the list that because of their age and their sexual desires that they would not be able to fully concentrate on the responsibility of serving at at the same level that the older widows would be able to do. Paul simply encourages these younger women to remarry, have more children, and be good mothers at home and good wives to their husbands. The listing or roll of widows in verse 9 had the limitation that those on the list should be at least 60 years old. And there were specific reasons for that. In verse 11, there are restrictions relative to this listing of widows when it states that the younger widows should not be taken into that number, and then it provides reasons. I mean, Paul gives them, this is the reason we want them to be 60 years old. Because if they're young, they're going to have these impulses, they're going to have these desires, they're going to have these lusts, they're going to become wanting against Christ, they're going to want to remarry, they're going to do this and that. I mean, the remarrying was fine, but they're just not going to be able to concentrate. You know, it's like a guy that's a pastor and he has 3 or 4 other businesses on the side. Well, it doesn't matter who he is or how gifted he thinks he might be or how qualified he is. It's going to be a distraction. It's going to be a parasite on his time, and he's not going to be able to give his life and his attention and to devote himself to the thing that God has called him to do. And so these women, they were mature and they were more unlikely to remarry. They might remarry, and I don't know if they would stay on the number, the listing, or not. I don't know. Verse 11, Paul states that the problem that the younger women had was that if they simply they would want to get remarried, which is not bad and exactly what he promotes in verse 14. So what Paul was outlining was that the women who would be placed on the list were women that had both the time and the maturity and the character that had been demonstrated over an extended period of time, and they had a significant desire to allow God to work in their life and to use them in the ministry. And in all likelihood, they would not have a desire to remarry. They were past that age. Maybe the companionship would be nice, but the ministry was going to sort of take the place of that in their life. And a younger widow who may have wanted to be on the list and who thought that after her husband died that she would simply give herself to the Lord, and then she's on the list and she's got responsibilities and she's out there, supposed to be doing certain things, and all of a sudden she gets these desires and she starts looking at men and she wants to get remarried and have more children, and she just gets distracted, and so they just cut it off at 60. Said, look, you got to be 60 years old. What if you're 59? Well, I don't know. I don't know what they did about that, but I'm just saying that they said, hey, there's a legitimate reason for all of this. I think that I'm going to stop here this evening, and we will take back up here in our next session. It will be class number 10, moving along. Thank goodness, I think that we're getting through some of this fairly quickly. We still have a little more ways to go, especially when we talk about honoring the elders and all of that. I pray that somehow that this idea of widows and what it means to be a widow, that you understand that it's not just talking about widows, that we're talking about ministry, we're talking about needs, we're talking about everything that relates to being active in a local church, and we need to recognize that. We need to appreciate that. I pray that God would bless you and that you would be encouraged by all of these things. Thank you.